as far as all the mold making, resin casting, and that sort of stuff is concerned, the Scoutfly lantern is pretty much done. I still have to take the time to clean it up and glue all the pieces together and give it its final fit up, but as far as making molds for everything goes, I've got that all complete. So there's not too much to talk about here other than a couple interesting things I did just to kind of get the most out of my materials. Now, since I don't have access to a 3D printer or a laser cutter or anything too expensive, I made do with cardstock, foam core, bits of EVA foam, and other simple things. And for a lot of my materials, what I ended up using was silicone bought from the craft store with a coupon and the trial kits of the Smoothcast 300, which is probably the most professional thing I've got in my shop right now. But conserving materials is something that's a lot easier to do when you're working on smaller miniatures, like the little gondola figurines and some of the other stuff I've made. When working with large pieces like this that are several inches across and several inches tall, it becomes very easy to use a lot of silicone very quickly. And it's nice that silicone is reusable, but at the same time it's kind of a large investment, especially in my case when we're talking about, you know, $10-20 worth of silicone on a single piece. So I'm definitely going to have to get some extra use out of these. So let's just cut ahead here. So here we have the mold already half filled, but as you can see, it's not quite deep enough to fully reach up to the little knob on the top of the Scoutfly lantern's lid. So what I ended up doing was waiting until the silicone had partially set, and then I took the little cardboard inner ring that you get with rolls of tape, and I kind of wiggled that in there, because before the silicone fully sets, it has a very sticky sort of texture to it, and I made sure to wiggle it in and firmly attach it, and then I just poured more silicone in on top. And this gave me sort of a staggered, almost like a cake style mold, but it ended up working perfectly. There's nothing all that crazy about this process once you understand that in both the case of silicone and resin, the partially cured or sometimes even fully cured material will bond with a freshly mixed batch. So even though they kind of cured at two different rates with that sort of uppermost knob getting a fresher batch of silicone, it's still perfectly bound with the mostly cured silicone that was beneath it. And in the case of actually casting it in resin, I did it in many smaller batches to kind of carefully fill it a little bit at a time, and it ended up working out fine, even though you would think casting it in multiple layers would cause it to split apart or not fully join together. But silicone wants to stick to silicone and resin wants to stick to resin, but luckily they don't want to stick to each other. Anyways, after getting both the cap and that sort of inner cylinder of the lantern cast, I moved on to working on what I'm going to call the bulb of the Scoutfly lantern. We're going to cut ahead to that right now. Now for the bulb of the lantern, what I ended up using was literally just an old piece of PVC pipe I had laying around, and I yet again went into Inkscape, made a pattern where everything was kind of spaced out and sized out in relation to the measurements I had come up with. I want to say this is just a bit wider than it is in my calculations, but that's fine. This kind of goes into wanting it to have a little bit more visual weight than it should have within proportions to the scale and all that. But what I ended up doing was gluing that pattern to the piece of PVC and then going in and drilling out many holes. Since I had so many holes to drill, I didn't trust myself to do this by hand. So what I ended up doing is using this little Dremel drill press, which I received as a gift. They're not terribly expensive, but they're very useful to have. So what I did was I went over each one with multiple holes punched in with a little 1/8 inch drill, and then I would go in and clean it up a little bit later with a grinding bit. And not a lot to say about this process, it's just going in and punching hole after hole, and very carefully, very patiently cleaning it out until it kind of looks the way I need it to look, which you can see here. With all the holes drilled out, what I did was plug up the inside with a dowel rod that had been coated in a few layers of masking tape and then clear packing tape, just so it would be something the silicone wouldn't stick to. But this is also a very difficult kind of piece to mold, and as you can imagine, having the silicone leak in there would more or less make it a terrible unusable mold. The solution I ended up coming up with involved making it a sort of two-part mold. One part would cast the outside and then be split down the side like a normal sort of one-part mold where you kind of cut that relief in there to open it up. And then the second part would be cast on the inside, but cast within the same sort of cardboard tube I was using as the mold walls. So it kind of created an end-to-end silicone mold that filled up that cardboard tube, where one end was the plug, which I had filled with these wooden dowel rods just to give it a little bit more rigidity. I didn't want that piece kind of wiggling around so much, and you can see me just chopping off the extra bits here. But so I had one end that was the plug, as you can see, and another end which was sort of a sleeve that goes around it. And when those are slipped together and then re-entered into the cardboard tube I was using as the mold walls, it holds it all in place, and it actually ends up creating a sort of perfect shell for the casting of the Scoutfly bulb. Now, as a technique you can use in your own projects or for other future projects, I'm not sure how much this particular setup can be used for. But generally, casting something that has holes that pass through the inside to the outside is a giant pain in the butt. Casting something that has a hollow relief in it has all kinds of difficulties to it. For some of you who are more experienced in this kind of prop making and mold making and casting, this may not be a mind-blowing technique, but for me it was kind of a big deal, because this is a strangely shaped piece that I needed to make a mold out of, and it proposed all kinds of difficulties with the shape and size and the fact that it was hollow, but that it was closed on one end, but it was full of holes. It's a whole thing. But the takeaway here is that there's all kinds of different techniques for using silicone, from pouring multiple layers to walling off your mold, building your mold box in certain ways, taking into account the extra space or the properties of both your silicone as well as your other materials, like the fact that I'm using these cardboard tubes makes a big difference on how some of these molds are made. So it's a thing to consider. It's something that you learn with experience. It's something that makes more sense the more you work with these different materials. But yeah, I guess I just want to brag about that mostly because I'm really proud of myself. But if you find a use for a technique like this, maybe you found this very interesting, and in the future this will inspire you. And if that's the case, I hope you come back here and tell me so, because I'm not sure what else you could use such a weird sort of two-part mold technique for, using this specific kind of arrangement of mold pieces. Just to wrap things up, I want to show the molds being opened, just so you can kind of see how they function after they've had resin poured into them. Surprisingly, this was my first pull from the Scoutfly lantern bulb mold that I had made there, and it ended up working out fine. Even though it's technically open at both ends, the secondary, like the part 2 of the mold, plugs up very nicely, and there was no leakage whatsoever. does grip into the mold fairly tightly, so it took a little bit of a struggle. Unfortunately, because the top of the lantern bulb is the bottom of the mold when the resin is being poured into it, it does put up a little bit of a fight to remove it. But once it's free, and once you get it part of the way out, it slips out, and there's surprisingly no flashing, very little in the way of seams. Since this is still so fresh, the resin was a little soft. So just to make sure, I went and stuffed the dowel rod I used to plug it up in the first place, just to make sure it kind of fully solidified around the shape I needed to have. Now the mold there just kind of perfectly sits in. I had cut in a little registration mark, but in combination with the inner pattern of the cardboard tube there, that little spiral pattern, and the registration marks, and the kind of inset holes that, or rather inset plugs that make up the holes in the bulb, it all locks into place. This mold here is just the kind of outer rim of the upper end of the Scoutfly lantern, and it was just cast as one big piece. A little bit of a pain in the butt to get out, because I did need to overfill it just a little bit more than usual to make sure that it was fully filled to the top, obviously. But this one was a little bit thicker than the other mold I had made for the Scoutfly cap, just because that would allow it to hold its shape and stand up on its own without needing lots of support. As you can see up at the top there, I do have the Scoutfly cap mold also being used, but we will get to that in a moment. I think one of the details I forgot to mention when I was talking about working on this particular part of the Scoutfly lantern is that the thread I used is a wax thread, which is used in some jewelry and some leatherworking. And as you can see, it actually captured all of those details really, really well. If I had used a normal thread, I don't think it would have caused as much of a problem, but the wax thread just did not stick to the silicone at all, allowing it to fully transfer over that texture, and even very, very nicely capture that little back stitching that I put in there, even though that's going to be completely invisible, or out of sight at least. But yeah, other than taking just a lot of silicone, that mold came out just fine, but it's a very basic mold. Now the other thing I did, in a very similar but reverse sort of method to how I made the mold in the first place, I staggered out the resin pour on this one and put in these little dividers so that the cap was not fully cast fully solid. Yet again, since that underside is meant to be obscured by being on top of the lantern, having it be fully solid just makes it heavier, wastes a lot more material, and is kind of unnecessary. Which is why I ended up casting a second one, because even though the first one came out alright, despite a few air bubbles on the under edge, it's heavy. It's kind of easily the heaviest part on the lantern right now, weighing in at 100 or so grams. Now, when you compare it to the new one, which will actually be even a little bit lighter once those other parts are removed from the inside, it's about half the weight, give or take, which makes a big difference, especially for something that's going to be hanging off a belt. But I think that about covers it for the mold making I've been doing. I may do one more video after I've done the glue up, all the fit up and everything, and gotten everything together, but I don't think there's so much more I can really do on the Scoutfly lantern. Rather than being sort of a tutorial video or a step-by-step process, this was more of like an update vlog. And even in the case of this video, this one went up about 3 days late, which is mostly my fault. So, going forward from this point, I've unfortunately, well, there's no way else to say it, I screwed myself. I've got about a month and a half, give or take, to finish a set of Monster Hunter armor and a weapon to go with it, so it can be ready in time for ASEN. Anime Central, which happens in Rosemont, Illinois every year, about mid-May. And I go every year. It's one of my favorite conventions. But yeah, Monster Hunter is going to be very big this year at a lot of conventions, especially because of Monster Hunter World, and I badly want to have some new armor to strut around in with my new Monster Hunter friends who have discovered the series and are greatly enjoying Monster Hunter World. If you haven't played Monster Hunter World, pick it up on PS4 or Xbox One, or if you're not a console kind of person, wait for the PC version in, I think it's going to be late August is what they've said. But regardless, I don't have a lot of time, and I've got to like really knock out this armor as fast as possible. So the next few weeks are going to be kind of a frenzy for me. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, which you should watch, I might have to do something that's more updates and less tutorial. So more crafty blog, less fancy video editing. But a lot of the steps I've taken in this video series aren't necessarily going to be used for making the armor. I'm going to go more of a foam smithing route, which if you haven't watched, say, Evil Ted or Bill Duran's Punished Props Academy videos, highly recommend watching those. Also check out Kamui Cosplay. She just recently finished a set of Zinogre armor and is now working on a Nergigante set, and her stuff just looks amazing. She does some great stuff with foam smithing, LED lights, and just some truly amazing paint jobs. Makes her stuff really pop. And I'm going to be kind of pulling from everything I've learned idly watching them for the past few years. But yeah, I might do another video sooner rather than later, just to stick to the one video a week policy I've set for myself, and also to make up for the fact that I was late this week. But all the usual crap applies. Like, comment, subscribe, follow me on the social medias, check out what I'm doing on Instagram, etc. And hopefully you'll join me for the next video. So, thanks for watching. Maybe you found this informative, maybe you didn't. I'd love to hear what you think. So, till then.